In the dim corridors of power where ambition meets reality, where dreams collide with the unforgiving machinery of the world, there exists a fundamental truth that separates those who ascend from those who remain forever groveling in the shadows of their own limitations. This truth, as sharp and cutting as a Florentine blade, was understood by Niccolò Machiavelli 5 centuries ago when he penned his observations on power, transformation, and the nature of human strength. The truth is this: we are all born weak, shaped by circumstances beyond our control, molded by fears we inherit, and constrained by beliefs that serve not our greatness but our mediocrity. Consider the young merchant's son in Renaissance Florence, trembling as he approaches the guildmaster's chamber. His hands shake not from the cold stone corridors but from the weight of his own self-imposed limitations. He carries with him the voice of his father, warning him to know his place, the whispers of his mother cautioning him against reaching too high, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who chose safety over sovereignty. This merchant's son stands at the precipice of transformation, though he does not yet know it. He believes his trembling hands betray weakness, but they merely reveal the presence of a self that must die for a stronger one to be born. The architecture of weakness is not built in a day, nor is it constructed by external forces alone. It is a masterpiece of self-sabotage, erected brick by brick through years of choosing comfort over challenge, acceptance over rebellion, and conformity over creation. Every time we silence our ambitions to please others, we add another stone to this prison. Every time we accept good enough when excellence beckons, we strengthen the bars that will ultimately confine us. Every time we choose the familiar path over the uncertain journey toward greatness, we become the architects of our own mediocrity. But what is weakness, truly? It is not the absence of strength, for even the weakest among us possess reserves of power they have never accessed. Weakness is the presence of a false self, a collection of limiting beliefs, inherited fears, and socially conditioned responses that masquerade as our true nature. It is the voice that whispers, "You cannot," when circumstances demand, "You must." It is the comfortable cage we construct around ourselves, furnished with the soft pillows of excuses and decorated with the familiar wallpaper of our limitations. The weak self is a master of disguise. It appears in the form of humility when it is actually cowardice. It masquerades as prudence when it is merely the paralysis of overthinking. It presents itself as loyalty when it is nothing more than the fear of standing alone. It speaks the language of responsibility while practicing the art of self-betrayal. This false self is not evil, it is simply inadequate for the demands of a world that rewards strength, punishes weakness, and remains indifferent to our excuses. In the grand theater of life, the weak self plays many roles. Sometimes it is the victim, gathering sympathy and attention through tales of suffering and misfortune. Other times it is the martyr, sacrificing its potential on the altar of others' expectations. Occasionally, it performs as the perfectionist, using impossible standards as an excuse for inaction. Most often, it simply plays the role of the ordinary person, blending seamlessly into the crowd, neither offensive nor remarkable, neither hated nor truly respected. The tragedy of the weak self lies not in its suffering but in its wasted potential. Every individual born into this world carries within them the seeds of greatness, the raw materials of transformation, and the capacity for achievements that would astonish their current self. But the weak self guards these treasures jealously, like a dragon hoarding gold it will never spend. It prefers the security of known limitations to the uncertainty of unlimited possibility. Consider the anatomy of a typical day in the life of one dominated by weakness. The alarm sounds, and immediately the negotiations begin. 5 more minutes, the weak self pleads, establishing the pattern of compromise that will define the hours ahead. Breakfast becomes an opportunity for self-indulgence rather than fuel for achievement. The commute transforms into a passive consumption of others' thoughts through mindless entertainment rather than active preparation for the day's battles. At work, the weak self seeks the path of least resistance, avoiding difficult conversations, sidestepping challenging projects, and finding comfort in the familiar routines that require no growth, no risk, no evolution. Relationships, too, become casualties of the weak self's dominion. Love becomes neediness, friendship becomes dependency, and professional relationships become exercises in people-pleasing rather than mutual respect earned through competence and character. The weak self attracts other weak selves, creating circles of mutual limitation where everyone's mediocrity is validated and nobody's excellence is demanded or expected. But, perhaps the most insidious aspect of weakness is its ability to rationalize itself. The weak self becomes a master philosopher, crafting elaborate justifications for its limitations. I'm being realistic, it claims when abandoning ambitious goals. I'm being humble, it declares when avoiding leadership opportunities. I'm being responsible, it argues when choosing security over growth. These rationalizations are not lies in the conventional sense, they are sophisticated self-deceptions that make weakness appear virtuous and strength seem foolish. The weak self also employs comparison as a weapon against transformation. It constantly measures itself against those who are weaker, finding comfort in relative superiority rather than pursuing absolute excellence. At least I'm not as bad as him, becomes a substitute for I will become better than I was yesterday. The weak self seeks the lowest common denominator in every situation, finding validation in shared mediocrity rather than inspiration in observed excellence. Yet for all its elaborate defenses and sophisticated justifications, the weak self lives in constant fear of exposure. Deep within, it knows it is an imposter, a collection of borrowed beliefs and inherited limitations masquerading as authentic identity. This knowledge creates a persistent anxiety, a background hum of dissatisfaction that no amount of external validation can silence. The weak self fears challenge not because it might fail, but because success would reveal the arbitrary nature of its self-imposed limitations. The weak self also fears solitude, for in silence and stillness, its false nature becomes apparent. It surrounds itself with noise, distraction, and the constant chatter of others to avoid the confrontation with its own inadequacy. It becomes addicted to external validation because it has no internal source of strength to draw upon. It seeks constant confirmation of its worth from others because it has never learned to generate that confirmation from within. But weakness, for all its apparent comfort and familiarity, exacts a terrible price. It robs us of our agency, transforming us from authors of our destiny into characters in someone else's story. It steals our time, convincing us to spend precious hours on activities that diminish rather than enhance our power. It corrupts our relationships, turning love into manipulation, friendship into transaction, and respect into mere politeness. Most cruelly, it wastes our potential, allowing talents to atrophy, dreams to fade, and possibilities to die unrealized. The weak self is also a poor strategist in the game of life. It focuses on avoiding loss rather than seeking gain, on preventing failure rather than achieving success. It plays not to lose rather than playing to win, and, in doing so, it ensures that even its victories are pale shadows of what might have been achieved through bold action and calculated risk. The weak self is reactive rather than proactive, responding to circumstances rather than creating them, adapting to the world rather than shaping it according to its will. In the realm of decision-making, the weak self is paralyzed by an illusion of infinite choice. It believes that by keeping all options open, it maintains maximum flexibility, not realizing that the refusal to choose is itself a choice for mediocrity, indecision, and the gradual erosion of personal power. The strong understand that power comes not from having many options but from the ability to choose decisively and commit fully to that choice, whatever the consequences. The weak self also misunderstands the nature of comfort and security. It believes that safety lies in avoiding risk, not realizing that the greatest risk is the gradual decay that comes from a life unlived. It seeks comfort in the familiar, not understanding that true security comes from the strength and adaptability that can only be developed through facing and overcoming challenges. The weak self builds walls to keep danger out, not realizing that it is simultaneously keeping growth, opportunity, and life itself at bay. As we examine the architecture of weakness, we must also acknowledge its social function. Society, in many ways, is organized to produce and maintain weakness in its members. Institutions reward compliance over innovation, conformity over creativity, and obedience over independent thought. The educational system teaches us to seek approval from authority figures rather than to trust our own judgment. The corporate world rewards those who play by existing rules rather than those who create new ones. Even our families, with the best of intentions, often transmit their own fears and limitations to us, confusing love with protection and care with control. This social reinforcement of weakness creates what we might call the comfort conspiracy, a collective agreement to maintain the status quo, to avoid the discomfort of growth, and to settle for shared mediocrity rather than risk the isolation that often accompanies excellence. The weak self finds comfort in this conspiracy because it provides external validation for internal limitations. It's easier to believe that this is just how things are than to accept responsibility for transforming both ourselves and our circumstances. But the weak self's greatest fear is not failure, judgment, or even pain. Its greatest fear is its own potential. Deep within every weak self lies the knowledge that transformation is possible, that strength can be cultivated, that the current self is not the final self. This knowledge is simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, threatening and promising. The weak self fears this potential because realizing it would require the destruction of everything familiar, comfortable, and safe about the current identity. The paradox of weakness is that it requires enormous energy to maintain. The constant vigilance required to avoid challenge, the mental gymnastics needed to justify limitation, the emotional labor involved in seeking validation from others, all of this is exhausting. The weak self is perpetually tired, not from the effort of achievement but from the effort of avoidance. It expends vast amounts of energy maintaining an elaborate facade of competence while avoiding the actual work of becoming competent. Yet within this very exhaustion lies the seed of transformation. The weak self's elaborate defenses eventually become too expensive to maintain. The gap between who we are and who we could become eventually becomes too wide to ignore. The pain of remaining the same eventually exceeds the pain of change. It is in these moments of breakdown that breakthrough becomes possible, when the weak self's carefully constructed prison reveals itself to be nothing more than shadows and smoke, easily dispersed by the light of conscious awareness and deliberate action. The recognition of our weakness is not a cause for despair but for celebration, for it marks the beginning of the end of our limitations. Like a doctor diagnosing a disease, we cannot treat what we do not acknowledge. The weak self thrives in darkness, in the unconscious repetition of limiting patterns and the automatic acceptance of inherited beliefs. But, when exposed to the light of conscious examination, it begins to lose its power over us. This is where the Machiavellian understanding of power becomes crucial. Machiavelli observed that those who understand the nature of power, both their own and others, possess a tremendous advantage in navigating the complexities of human existence. He recognized that power is not a fixed quantity but a dynamic force that can be cultivated, concentrated, and directed toward specific ends. Most importantly, he understood that the first step in gaining power over others is gaining power over oneself. The weak self operates under the illusion that power is something external, something that others possess and can grant or withhold from us. It seeks permission, approval, and validation from external authorities, not realizing that true power comes from within. The transformation from weakness to strength begins with the recognition that we are not victims of our circumstances but authors of our responses to those circumstances. As we stand at the threshold of transformation, looking back at the architecture of weakness we have so carefully constructed, we must resist the temptation to judge ourselves harshly. The weak self, for all its limitations, served a purpose. It kept us safe during vulnerable periods of development. It helped us navigate social situations where strength might have been punished. It allowed us to belong, to fit in, to avoid the loneliness that often accompanies those who dare to be different. But, now, as we prepare for the destruction and reconstruction that transformation requires, we must bid farewell to this faithful but inadequate servant. The weak self has brought us as far as it can. From here, we must proceed alone, armed only with the knowledge that we are more than we have allowed ourselves to become and the determination to prove it through action rather than words. The architecture of weakness, so carefully constructed over years or decades, will not crumble overnight. It was built to last, reinforced with fear, cemented with habit, and decorated with the comfortable illusion of safety. But every structure, no matter how imposing, has weak points where the right pressure, applied consistently and with precision, can bring about its complete collapse. The weak self's foundation is built on lies about our limitations, its walls are constructed from inherited fears that are not our own, and its roof is supported by the approval of others who are themselves trapped in their own prisons of mediocrity. Understanding the architecture of weakness is the first step in the Machiavellian transformation. We must study our enemy, and, make no mistake, the weak self is our enemy before we can defeat it. We must map its defenses, understand its strategies, and identify its vulnerabilities. Only then can we begin the systematic dismantling that will clear the ground for the construction of our authentic, powerful self. The journey from weakness to strength is not a comfortable one. It requires us to abandon familiar limitations, to risk the unknown, and to stand alone in our convictions even when the world demands conformity. But the alternative, remaining forever trapped in the prison of our lesser self, is far worse than any temporary discomfort transformation might bring. As we prepare to leave the realm of weakness behind, we must remember that this departure is not just personal but political, not just individual but revolutionary. Every person who breaks free from their limitations inspires others to question their own. Every individual who chooses strength over comfort challenges the social systems that depend on widespread weakness for their maintenance. Every transformation is both a personal victory and a contribution to the collective evolution of human consciousness. The weak self will fight for its survival. It will offer compelling arguments for remaining unchanged, seductive visions of comfort and safety, and dire warnings about the dangers of transformation. It will recruit allies from among our friends, family, and colleagues who have invested in our remaining small. It will use every weapon in its considerable arsenal to prevent the death that transformation requires. But we are no longer innocent victims of our conditioning. We have seen through the illusion of our limitations. We have mapped the architecture of our weakness and identified the points where it can be dismantled. We understand now that we are not our thoughts, our emotions, our fears, or our past. We are the consciousness that observes these phenomena, the awareness that can choose which thoughts to entertain, which emotions to cultivate, and which actions to take. Armed with this knowledge and driven by the vision of who we can become, we now turn our attention to the tools and strategies that will enable our transformation. The weak self has had its day, now begins the reign of the strong self, forged in the fires of deliberate struggle and tempered by the conscious choice to become more than we were born to be. Part 2. The alchemy of transformation. The destruction of weakness is not accomplished through wishful thinking, positive affirmations, or the comfortable delusions that populate the shelves of contemporary self-help literature. True transformation, the kind that creates unshakable strength and authentic power, requires what the ancient alchemists understood as the fundamental principle of their art: solviti coagula, dissolve and coagulate, destroy and rebuild. The weak self must be systematically dismantled before the strong self can be consciously constructed. Picture the master sculptor approaching a block of rough marble, seeing within its crude exterior the magnificent statue that awaits liberation. He does not hesitate to strike with his chisel, does not mourn the fragments that fall away, does not preserve the shapeless mass out of sentimental attachment to its original form. He understands that creation requires destruction, that beauty emerges only through the ruthless elimination of everything that obscures it. So too must we approach our own transformation with the tools of conscious destruction in one hand and deliberate reconstruction in the other. The first tool in this alchemical process is radical honesty, not the superficial honesty of admitting small flaws or minor shortcomings, but the profound honesty that examines every belief, challenges every assumption, and questions every aspect of our current identity. This honesty is painful because it reveals the extent to which we have been living as strangers to ourselves, accepting limitations that are not our own, pursuing goals that do not serve us, and maintaining relationships that diminish rather than enhance our power. Radical honesty begins with the recognition that most of our thoughts are not our own. They are inherited from parents who were themselves products of their conditioning, absorbed from societies that benefit from our compliance, and borrowed from cultures that mistake conformity for wisdom. The voice in our head that whispers limitations, that counsels caution, that advises us to be realistic, is not our authentic voice but a collection of other people's fears, doubts, and surrender to mediocrity. Consider the merchant who finally recognized that his fear of expansion was not based on genuine market analysis but on his father's bankruptcy 30 years earlier. Consider the artist who realized that her resistance to sharing her work stemmed not from perfectionism but from a teacher's casual dismissal of her talent in childhood. Consider the leader who discovered that his reluctance to make difficult decisions was rooted not in wisdom but in his mother's disapproval of conflict. These revelations are not comfortable, but they are liberating, for they reveal that what we thought were permanent limitations are merely temporary programs that can be rewritten. The process of radical honesty requires us to examine not only our obvious limitations but also our apparent strengths. Often, what we consider our virtues are simply sophisticated forms of weakness. The person who prides themselves on being easygoing may actually be someone who lacks the courage to state their preferences. The individual who boasts of being humble might be using self-deprecation to avoid the vulnerability of genuine confidence. The leader who is celebrated for being collaborative could be someone who fears making decisions alone and taking responsibility for the consequences. This examination must extend to our goals and ambitions as well. How many of our dreams are actually our own, and how many have been suggested by others who seek to live vicariously through our achievements? How many of our pursuits stem from genuine passion, and how many from the desire to prove ourselves worthy of love, respect, or acceptance? How many of our accomplishments have enhanced our authentic power, and how many have merely fed the ego of a false self that was never real to begin with? The second tool of transformation is the deliberate cultivation of discomfort. The weak self thrives on comfort, familiarity, and the absence of challenge. It has arranged life to minimize risk, avoid confrontation, and maintain the illusion of control. But strength, like muscle, grows only under stress. Power, like a blade, is sharpened only through friction. The character, like precious metal, is purified only in the fire of adversity. This cultivation of discomfort must be systematic and progressive. Begin with small challenges that stretch your comfort zone without breaking it entirely. The person who has never spoken in public might start by asking a question at a small meeting. The individual who has avoided confrontation might practice stating their boundaries in low-stakes situations. The one who has never led might volunteer to organize a small project among friends or colleagues. But discomfort alone is insufficient, it must be paired with conscious choice and deliberate action. Random suffering teaches nothing, chosen struggle develops everything. The difference lies in agency, the recognition that we are not victims of circumstances but active participants in our own development. When we choose our struggles, we transform suffering from something that happens to us into something we use for our growth. Physical training provides an excellent metaphor for this process. The weak person avoids exercise because it is uncomfortable, not realizing that this avoidance guarantees continued weakness. The transforming person embraces physical challenge not because they enjoy pain but because they understand pain as the price of strength. They lift weights not to punish their body but to forge it into a more powerful instrument. They run not to escape their problems but to develop the mental resilience to face them. The same principle applies to mental, emotional, and spiritual development. We must deliberately seek situations that challenge our existing capabilities, expose our current limitations, and force us to develop new strengths. This might mean taking on projects that seem beyond our current skill level, pursuing relationships with people who challenge our thinking, or placing ourselves in environments where our old patterns of behavior are ineffective. The third tool is the practice of conscious discipline, not the harsh, punitive discipline that the weak self fears, but the intelligent discipline that the strong self embraces as the foundation of freedom. Discipline is not the enemy of spontaneity but its prerequisite. We can only be truly free when we have mastered ourselves sufficiently to choose our responses rather than being driven by unconscious reactions. This discipline must address every aspect of our existence. Physical discipline involves training our body to be a reliable vehicle for our intentions rather than a source of limitation and distraction. Mental discipline means developing the ability to focus our attention where we choose, think clearly under pressure, and maintain perspective in challenging circumstances. Emotional discipline requires learning to experience our feelings without being controlled by them, to maintain equanimity in both success and failure, and to use emotional energy as fuel for action rather than allowing it to dissipate in drama or distraction. The discipline of time is perhaps the most crucial, for time is the raw material from which all achievement is fashioned. The weak self treats time casually, filling it with distractions, squandering it on activities that provide temporary pleasure but no lasting value. The strong self understands that time is the most precious resource, irreplaceable and finite, and therefore approaches each moment with the reverence it deserves. This does not mean becoming rigid or obsessive about schedules, but rather developing the ability to distinguish between activities that build our power and those that dissipate it, between engagements that contribute to our authentic goals and those that merely fill empty hours with busy work. It means learning to say no to the many trivial demands on our attention so that we can say yes to the few crucial opportunities for growth and contribution. The fourth tool is the development of strategic thinking. The weak self operates reactively, responding to whatever circumstances present themselves without consideration for long-term consequences or hidden motivations. The strong self thinks several moves ahead, understanding that current actions create future possibilities and that immediate sacrifices often enable greater gains. Strategic thinking requires us to understand not only our own goals and capabilities but also the goals and capabilities of others. In every human interaction, multiple agendas are at play, some explicit and others hidden. The person who cannot recognize these dynamics will be manipulated by those who can. This is not cynicism but realism. Understanding the political dimensions of human relationships allows us to navigate them more effectively and avoid being used by others who are more conscious of these dynamics. This strategic awareness must extend to our own internal dynamics as well. We must learn to recognize when our emotions are being triggered by past conditioning rather than present circumstances, when our reactions are serving others' agendas rather than our own, and when our habitual responses are preventing us from seeing new opportunities or creative solutions. The fifth tool is the cultivation of what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but excellence in the practical application of our capabilities to achieve our objectives. Virtue is the ability to adapt our approach to circumstances while remaining true to our essential goals, to be flexible in our methods while remaining firm in our purposes. This requires developing multiple competencies rather than relying on a single skill or approach. The person with only one tool sees every problem as requiring that tool's application. The person with a full toolkit can choose the most appropriate instrument for each situation. This might mean developing both analytical and intuitive capabilities, both assertive and collaborative skills, both the ability to lead and the wisdom to follow when leadership by others better serves the situation. Virtue also requires the ability to act decisively in the face of uncertainty and ambiguity. The weak self demands guarantees before taking action, not realizing that certainty is a luxury rarely available to those who seek to create rather than merely respond. The strong self understands that perfect information is not necessary for effective action, that waiting for ideal conditions often means waiting forever, and that the ability to act on partial information and adapt as circumstances develop is a crucial component of power. The sixth tool is the systematic elimination of energy drains. The weak self tolerates situations, relationships, and habits that consistently diminish its vitality, accepting these drains as inevitable aspects of existence. The strong self recognizes that energy is finite and precious, that every moment spent on activities that weaken us is a moment not available for activities that strengthen us. This elimination must be both external and internal. Externally, we must identify and address the relationships that deplete rather than energize us, the environments that diminish rather than enhance our capabilities, and the commitments that serve others' purposes rather than our own. This does not mean becoming selfish or uncaring, but rather recognizing that we cannot give what we do not have, cannot serve from emptiness, and cannot lift others if we ourselves are drowning. Internally, we must identify and eliminate the mental habits that waste our psychological energy. Worry about things beyond our control, resentment about past injustices, fantasy about unlikely future scenarios, all of these consume energy that could be directed toward constructive action. The discipline of attention means learning to recognize when our mind is engaged in these unproductive patterns and redirecting it toward more useful activities. The seventh tool is the conscious construction of empowering environments. Just as the weak self often finds itself in circumstances that reinforce its limitations, the strong self actively creates conditions that support its growth and expression. This includes the physical environment, which should inspire rather than depress, energize rather than drain, and remind us of our goals rather than our limitations. More importantly, it includes the social environment, the people we spend time with, the conversations we engage in, the ideas we expose ourselves to. The weak self often maintains relationships based on habit, comfort, or obligation, even when these relationships consistently discourage growth, punish excellence, or reward mediocrity. The strong self understands that we become like those we associate with most frequently, and therefore chooses companions who challenge us to be better, support our authentic goals, and exemplify qualities we wish to develop. This does not mean abandoning everyone who does not share our level of commitment to growth, but rather being conscious about the proportion of our time spent with those who elevate us versus those who diminish us. It means seeking mentors who have achieved what we wish to achieve, peers who share our commitment to excellence, and environments where our best qualities are encouraged rather than our worst tolerated. The eighth tool is the practice of what ancient warriors called dying before death, the willing sacrifice of our lesser self so that our greater self can be born. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of transformation because it requires us to let go of identities, relationships, and securities that have served us in the past but now limit our future. This death is not a single event but an ongoing process of releasing attachment to outdated versions of ourselves. Every time we choose growth over comfort, excellence over acceptance, truth over peace, we die a small death and are reborn slightly stronger. Every time we refuse to be limited by past failures, defined by others' expectations, or constrained by inherited beliefs, we practice this essential art of conscious dying. The fear of this death is what keeps most people trapped in their limitations. They prefer the familiar misery of their current self to the unknown possibilities of their potential self. They choose the devil they know over the angel they could become. But this fear is based on the illusion that we are losing something real when we are actually only losing illusions about ourselves that were never true to begin with. The ninth tool is the development of what we might call philosophical immunity, the ability to maintain our chosen direction despite criticism, misunderstanding, or outright opposition from others. When we begin to change in fundamental ways, we often find that our transformation triggers defensive responses from those around us. Our growth reminds them of their own stagnation, our courage highlights their own cowardice, our commitment to excellence makes their acceptance of mediocrity more difficult to justify. This resistance from others is not malicious but psychological. Most people have organized their lives around certain assumptions about what is possible, necessary, and appropriate. When someone in their environment begins operating according to different assumptions, it threatens the stability of their worldview. They may respond by criticizing our changes as unrealistic, unnecessary, or selfish, not because these criticisms are accurate but because our transformation challenges beliefs that are central to their own identity. Philosophical immunity does not mean becoming indifferent to others' opinions or immune to feedback. It means developing the ability to distinguish between criticism that serves our growth and criticism that serves others' comfort, between feedback that helps us improve and attacks that seek to diminish us. It means maintaining our commitment to our authentic path while remaining open to course corrections based on accurate information and genuine wisdom. The 10th tool is the cultivation of patience with the process itself. Transformation is not a linear progression but a spiral journey that often involves apparent setbacks, periods of confusion, and temporary returns to old patterns. The weak self expects immediate results and interprets any difficulty as evidence that the process is not working. The strong self understands that true change occurs in layers, that each apparent regression often precedes a quantum leap forward, and that lasting transformation requires time to integrate new ways of being. This patience must be balanced with urgency, not the frantic urgency of desperation but the focused urgency of someone who understands that time is limited and, therefore, precious. We must be patient with the process while being impatient with ourselves when we slip back into patterns that no longer serve us. We must allow time for change to occur while not using time as an excuse for inaction. The alchemy of transformation also requires us to understand the role of crisis in accelerating change. Often, our most significant growth occurs not during periods of comfort and stability but during times of challenge, loss, or upheaval. These crises, whether external or self-created, force us to access resources we didn't know we possessed, develop capabilities we had never tested, and discover strengths that were hidden beneath layers of comfortable familiarity. The strong self does not seek unnecessary suffering, but it does not waste the suffering that inevitably occurs in any meaningful life. Instead, it uses difficulty as raw material for growth, challenge as an opportunity for development, and setbacks as information about what needs to be adjusted in its approach. Every crisis becomes a curriculum, every failure becomes a teacher, every setback becomes a setup for a stronger comeback. As we practice these tools of transformation, we begin to notice subtle but significant changes in our experience of life. Tasks that once seemed overwhelming begin to appear manageable. Situations that once triggered automatic reactions begin to offer opportunities for conscious choice. People who once intimidated us begin to seem merely human. Challenges that once paralyzed us begin to energize us. These changes occur not because external circumstances have necessarily improved but because our relationship to circumstances has fundamentally shifted. We begin to see obstacles as training equipment, problems as puzzles to solve, and setbacks as temporary inconveniences rather than permanent defeats. We develop what athletes call game speed, the ability to perform effectively under pressure, think clearly in chaos, and maintain our standards even when conditions are far from ideal. The weak self sought to change its circumstances to match its capabilities. The strong self develops its capabilities to master any circumstances. The weak self demanded that the world accommodate its limitations. The strong self eliminates its limitations to serve the world more effectively. The weak self complained about the unfairness of life. The strong self accepts life's fundamental neutrality and focuses on creating favorable outcomes through superior preparation and execution. This transformation in perspective is perhaps more important than any specific skill or achievement because it affects every aspect of our experience. When we stop seeing ourselves as victims of circumstances and start seeing ourselves as agents of change, when we stop seeking comfort and start seeking growth, when we stop avoiding challenges and start embracing them as opportunities, we fundamentally alter the trajectory of our lives. But this altered perspective must be supported by altered action. Insight without implementation is merely intellectual entertainment. Understanding without application is just sophisticated procrastination. The tools of transformation are useless unless they are used consistently, persistently, and with the full commitment of our being. The practice of these tools creates what we might call a transformation momentum, a self-reinforcing cycle where each small change enables larger changes, where each small victory builds confidence for greater challenges, where each expansion of our comfort zone creates space for even greater expansion. This momentum is fragile in its early stages and must be protected from the sabotage of our own doubt and the interference of others who are invested in our remaining unchanged. As this momentum builds, we begin to experience what ancient traditions called the point of no return, the moment when our new identity becomes stronger than our old one, when our commitment to growth becomes more powerful than our attachment to comfort, when our vision of who we can become burns more brightly than our memory of who we used to be. This is the moment when transformation shifts from being something we do to being something we are. Yet even as we celebrate these victories and acknowledge our progress, we must remember that transformation is not a destination but a way of traveling. The strong self is not a fixed achievement but a dynamic process, not a permanent state but a continual becoming. The moment we believe we have completed our transformation is the moment we begin to calcify into a new form of limitation. The truly strong understand that strength itself must evolve, that power must be continually renewed, and that excellence is not a goal to be reached but a standard to be maintained. They understand that the price of strength is eternal vigilance against the creeping weakness that seeks to reclaim its former territory. They know that the war against limitation is not won in a single battle but through the daily choice to choose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, and excellence over acceptance. As we stand at the threshold between our old self and our new one, having applied the tools of transformation and begun to see their effects, we must prepare for the final phase of this journey. For it is one thing to destroy the weak self and quite another to construct a strong one. It is one thing to eliminate our limitations and quite another to build our power. It is one thing to know what we are moving away from and quite another to clearly envision and systematically create what we are moving toward. Part 3, The Fortress of the Strong. Having dissolved the architecture of weakness and practiced the alchemy of transformation, we now turn to the most crucial task, the deliberate construction of an authentic, powerful self that cannot be destroyed by external forces because it is not dependent upon them for its existence. This is not merely the absence of weakness but the presence of genuine strength that is self-generating, self-sustaining, and self-directed. The strong self is not built through wishful thinking or positive visualization but through the systematic development of capabilities, the conscious cultivation of character, and the deliberate creation of a worldview that serves power rather than limitation. It is constructed like a fortress, not to hide from the world but to engage with it from a position of unassailable strength. The foundation of this fortress is what we might call existential independence, the deep recognition that our worth, our identity, and our purpose originate from within rather than being granted or withdrawn by external authorities. This independence is not the shallow rebellion of adolescence, which defines itself in opposition to others, but the mature sovereignty of an individual who has discovered their own source of validation and direction. Existential independence begins with the radical acceptance of responsibility for our own experience. Not responsibility for everything that happens to us, which would be both grandiose and impossible, but responsibility for our response to whatever happens to us. This distinction is crucial because it places our power precisely where it belongs, not in controlling uncontrollable external events but in choosing our internal response to those events. Consider the prisoner in solitary confinement who maintains his dignity, continues his mental development, and preserves his hope for the future despite the most extreme external constraints. His circumstances are beyond his control, but his response to those circumstances remains entirely within his domain. He cannot choose freedom of movement, but he can choose freedom of thought. He cannot control his captor's actions, but he can control his own mental state. This is existential independence in its purest form, the recognition that the most important freedoms are internal and, therefore, unassailable by external force. But existential independence is not passive acceptance of adverse circumstances. On the contrary, it provides the stable foundation from which effective action can be taken to improve our situation. When we stop depending on external validation for our sense of worth, we become free to take risks that might result in disapproval but could lead to significant gains. When we stop requiring others' permission to pursue our goals, we become free to act on opportunities that others might not recognize or approve. The second pillar of the strong self's fortress is what we might call strategic thinking at the deepest level. This goes beyond the tactical planning we discussed earlier to encompass a fundamental understanding of how power operates in human relationships, how value is created and exchanged in society, and how to position ourselves advantageously within these larger systems. Strategic thinking at this level requires us to see patterns that others miss, to understand the underlying dynamics that drive surface events, and to recognize the long-term consequences of current trends. It means thinking in terms of decades rather than days, systems rather than symptoms, and root causes rather than immediate effects. This perspective allows us to make decisions that may seem counterintuitive in the short term but prove wise over time. The strategically strong individual understands that most people are reactive rather than proactive, emotional rather than rational, and short-term rather than long-term in their thinking. This understanding is not grounds for cynicism but for compassion and strategic advantage. By operating according to different principles, being proactive, rational, and long-term focused, we can often achieve objectives that seem impossible to those trapped in reactive patterns. This strategic thinking must be applied first to ourselves. We must understand our own patterns, tendencies, and blind spots with the same clarity that we seek to understand external systems. We must recognize when our emotions are being triggered by past conditioning rather than present circumstances, when our reactions are serving others' agendas rather than our own, and when our habitual responses are preventing us from seeing new opportunities. The third pillar is the development of what ancient warriors called indomitable spirit, the quality of character that refuses to surrender regardless of circumstances. This is not stubborn resistance to necessary change but the deep conviction that we possess the resources to handle whatever challenges life presents. It is the quiet confidence that comes from having faced difficulties before and discovered our capacity to overcome them. Indomitable spirit is cultivated through the deliberate practice of persisting in the face of obstacles, maintaining our standards under pressure, and refusing to compromise our essential values for temporary convenience. It grows stronger each time we choose the difficult right over the easy wrong, each time we maintain our integrity when shortcuts are available, each time we persist when others quit. This quality cannot be faked or borrowed, it must be earned through actual experience of testing ourselves against real challenges. The person who has never faced serious adversity cannot possess indomitable spirit, regardless of their intellectual understanding of the concept. Like physical strength, it must be developed through progressive resistance, by taking on challenges that stretch our current capabilities without overwhelming them entirely. The fourth pillar is what we might call value creation capacity, the ability to produce things that others need, want, or value. This is perhaps the most practical aspect of strength because it directly translates into influence, resources, and freedom in the external world. The person who can create value for others will never lack opportunities, resources, or allies. Value creation capacity requires us to develop genuine competence in areas that matter to the world, not just to ourselves. It means becoming excellent at something that others find useful, whether that is solving problems, creating beauty, providing service, or generating insights. This excellence cannot be superficial or merely apparent, it must be real, tested, and proven through results. This capacity must be continuously updated and expanded as the world changes. Skills that were valuable yesterday may become obsolete tomorrow. Industries that seem permanent may disappear within a generation. The strong individual does not cling to outdated competencies but continuously develops new ones, always maintaining an edge and creating value for others. But value creation is not merely about economic productivity. We can create value through beauty, wisdom, inspiration, leadership, protection, or healing. The key is that our contribution must be genuine and significant, something that makes the world better in some measurable way. When we possess this capacity, we become indispensable rather than expendable, sought after rather than tolerated, and powerful rather than powerless. The fifth pillar is emotional sovereignty, the ability to experience the full range of human emotions without being controlled by them. The weak self is either repressed, attempting to avoid negative emotions, or reactive, being overwhelmed by whatever emotion happens to arise. The strong self recognizes emotions as information and energy that can be channeled toward constructive purposes. Emotional sovereignty does not mean becoming emotionally flat or disconnected. On the contrary, it means being able to feel deeply while thinking clearly, to be passionate about our goals while remaining rational about our methods, and to be sensitive to others' emotions while not being manipulated by them. It is the difference between experiencing anger and being possessed by it, between feeling sadness and drowning in it, between enjoying pleasure and being addicted to it. This sovereignty is developed through the practice of observing our emotions without immediately acting on them, understanding their messages without being enslaved by their demands, and using their energy without being directed by their impulses. It requires us to develop what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between subtle variations in emotional states and respond appropriately to each. The emotionally sovereign individual can remain calm in crisis, enthusiastic in routine, and compassionate without being naive. They can be appropriately angry about injustice without being consumed by rage, appropriately sad about loss without being paralyzed by grief, and appropriately cautious about danger without being crippled by fear. The sixth pillar is intellectual rigor, the commitment to truth over comfort, accuracy over convenience, and understanding over opinion. The weak self believes what it wants to believe, accepts information that confirms its existing beliefs, and rejects data that challenges its worldview. The strong self seeks truth regardless of its implications for cherished beliefs, follows evidence wherever it leads, and changes its mind when presented with superior information or reasoning. Intellectual rigor requires us to examine our own thinking with the same skepticism we might apply to others, to question our assumptions as ruthlessly as we question others' conclusions, and to hold ourselves to the same standards of evidence and logic that we demand from others. It means distinguishing between what we know and what we believe, between what is certain and what is probable, and between what is proven and what is merely possible. This intellectual honesty must extend to our assessment of our own capabilities, achievements, and prospects. The weak self either inflates its abilities to protect its ego or deflates them to avoid responsibility. The strong self seeks accurate self-assessment as the foundation for effective action, understanding that self-deception may provide temporary comfort but ultimately leads to strategic errors and practical failures. The seventh pillar is relational wisdom, the ability to understand and navigate human relationships with skill, compassion, and effectiveness. This is not manipulation or people-pleasing but the sophisticated understanding of human nature that allows us to connect authentically, influence ethically, and collaborate productively. Relational wisdom recognizes that every person has their own needs, fears, desires, and limitations, and that effective relationships require us to understand and work with these realities rather than against them. It means being able to see situations from multiple perspectives, communicate in ways that others can hear and understand, and find solutions that serve everyone's legitimate interests. This wisdom also includes the ability to set and maintain appropriate boundaries, to say no when necessary, and to end relationships that are consistently destructive or draining. It means understanding the difference between being kind and being weak, between being assertive and being aggressive, and between being supportive and being enabling. The relationally wise individual can work effectively with people they dislike, can disagree without becoming disagreeable, and can maintain their integrity while adapting their communication style to different audiences and situations. They understand that influence flows not from position or authority alone but from the ability to help others achieve their goals while simultaneously advancing their own. The eighth pillar is what we might call systematic excellence, the commitment to doing things right consistently, not just when we feel like it or when others are watching. This is the opposite of the perfectionism that paralyzes action. It is the disciplined pursuit of quality in all areas of life that ultimately creates exceptional results. Systematic excellence means developing standards for ourselves that are higher than what others expect or demand, and then meeting those standards regardless of external pressure or internal resistance. It means taking pride in our work even when no one else will notice, maintaining our environment even when no one else will see it, and keeping our commitments even when breaking them would be convenient. This excellence becomes systematic when it is built into our habits and routines rather than depending on motivation or inspiration. The strong individual does excellent work not because they feel like it but because they have structured their life to make excellence automatic, natural, and inevitable. This systematic approach extends to all areas of life: physical health, intellectual development, skill acquisition, relationship maintenance, and spiritual growth. Rather than leaving these crucial areas to chance or good intentions, the strong self creates systems and structures that ensure consistent progress regardless of temporary circumstances or fleeting emotions. The ninth pillar is adaptive resilience, the ability to not merely survive challenges but to grow stronger through them. This goes beyond the simple resilience that allows us to bounce back from setbacks to the more sophisticated capacity to extract value from difficulties, learn from failures, and use adversity as fuel for development. Adaptive resilience recognizes that change, challenge, and even crisis are not aberrations to be avoided but normal features of any meaningful life. Rather than trying to create a life free from difficulty, the adaptively resilient individual develops the capabilities needed to thrive in difficulty. They understand that stability comes not from avoiding change but from developing the flexibility to surf the waves of change effectively. This resilience is built through the deliberate practice of taking on challenges, the conscious extraction of lessons from every experience, and the systematic development of multiple capabilities that can be called upon in different circumstances. It is strengthened by exposure to controlled difficulties that build our capacity to handle uncontrolled ones. The adaptively resilient individual does not merely endure hardship, they transform it into wisdom, strength, and capability. They do not merely overcome obstacles, they use obstacles as training equipment for developing greater power. They do not merely survive crises, they emerge from crises more capable than they were before. The 10th and final pillar is what we might call evolutionary consciousness, the recognition that our current self, no matter how strong, is not our final self. This consciousness drives continuous growth, learning, and development throughout life. It prevents the complacency that often accompanies success and maintains the hungry edge that characterizes all truly powerful individuals. Evolutionary consciousness understands that in a rapidly changing world, standing still is moving backward, that maintaining current capabilities is insufficient when others are developing new ones, and that yesterday's solutions may not be adequate for tomorrow's challenges. It drives us to continuously question our assumptions, update our methods, and expand our capacities. This consciousness also recognizes that our individual evolution is connected to the evolution of our species and our world. As we become stronger, more capable, and more conscious, we contribute to the collective elevation of human potential. Our personal transformation is not merely self-serving but serves the larger purpose of advancing human consciousness and capability. With these 10 pillars in place, the strong self possesses a fortress that cannot be destroyed by external forces because it is not dependent upon them for its existence. This strength is not brittle, like the hardness of a rock that shatters under sufficient pressure, but flexible, like the strength of a tree that bends without breaking in the strongest wind. The paradox of this strength is that it makes us simultaneously more independent and more connected. Independent because we no longer need others to validate our worth, approve our decisions, or guarantee our security. Connected because our strength allows us to engage more fully, love more freely, and serve more effectively than was possible when we were focused on protecting our weakness. This transformation from weakness to strength is not just personal but social and political.
Every individual who breaks free from limitation inspires others to question their own. Every person who develops genuine power challenges the systems that depend on widespread powerlessness for their maintenance.
Every individual who chooses growth over comfort contributes to the collective evolution of human consciousness. But this strength must be wielded wisely.
Power without wisdom becomes tyranny. Strength without compassion becomes brutality. Capability without purpose becomes mere ego inflation.
The truly strong understand that their power is not an end in itself but a means to serve purposes larger than themselves. The strong self also recognizes that this transformation is never complete, that vigilance against weakness must be eternal, and that the price of strength is continuous effort. The weak self does not disappear entirely, it merely loses its dominance. In moments of stress, fatigue, or uncertainty, old patterns may reassert themselves. The strong individual does not judge these temporary regressions but simply notices them and redirects energy toward more empowering patterns. As we conclude this exploration of the Machiavellian transformation from weakness to strength, we must acknowledge that this journey is not for everyone. It requires sacrifice, discipline, and the courage to stand alone when necessary. It demands that we give up the comfortable illusions that make weakness tolerable in exchange for the sometimes harsh realities that make strength possible.
But, for those who undertake this journey with full commitment, the rewards are immeasurable.
Not just personal power, influence, and freedom, but the deep satisfaction of becoming who we were truly meant to be. Not just the ability to achieve our goals, but the wisdom to choose goals worthy of our efforts. Not just the strength to survive whatever life brings, but the capacity to thrive regardless of circumstances. The man or woman who destroys their weak self through conscious effort can never be destroyed by others because they have faced their greatest enemy, their own limitations, and emerged victorious. They have built their strength on the foundation of self-knowledge, their power on the bedrock of personal responsibility, and their freedom on the cornerstone of voluntary discipline. They have learned the ultimate secret of human existence, that we are not fixed beings subject to external forces but dynamic creators capable of continuous transformation. They have discovered that our greatest enemy is not circumstance, other people, or even death, but the part of ourselves that accepts limitation as permanent and mediocrity as inevitable. In transforming themselves, they have contributed to the transformation of the world. In choosing strength over weakness, they have made it easier for others to make the same choice. In refusing to accept the limitations imposed by society, genetics, or circumstance, they have expanded the realm of human possibility for all who come after them. This is the true legacy of the Machiavellian transformation, not the accumulation of personal power for its own sake, but the demonstration that such transformation is possible, that ordinary human beings can become extraordinary through conscious effort, and that the future of our species depends not on external salvation but on individual evolution. The weak self is seductive because it promises comfort, safety, and the absence of struggle. But these promises are illusions that evaporate when tested against reality. The strong self promises nothing except the opportunity to face reality with dignity, capability, and purpose. For those who have tasted genuine strength, no other way of living is tolerable. The choice between weakness and strength is not made once but every day, in every moment when we must decide between comfort and growth, between what is easy and what is necessary, between who we have been and who we could become. Each choice builds upon the last, creating momentum in one direction or the other. Choose strength. Choose growth. Choose to become the person who cannot be defeated because they have already defeated their greatest enemy, the part of themselves that accepted limitation as permanent. Choose to join the ranks of those who have refused to settle for less than their full potential, who have paid the price that strength demands, and who have earned the freedom that only the truly powerful can enjoy. The weak self will always be with us, whispering its seductive lies about safety, comfort, and the impossibility of change. But now we know its voice for what it is, not our authentic voice but an echo of inherited fears, absorbed limitations, and borrowed beliefs. We have learned to listen instead to the voice of our strong self, which speaks not in words but in actions, not in promises but in results, not in dreams but in achievements. The transformation is possible. The tools are available. The choice is ours. What remains is simply to begin, to continue, and to never surrender to the forces that would keep us small. For in the end, we will be judged not by how comfortable we kept ourselves but by how fully we realized our potential, not by how well we fit in but by how courageously we stood out, not by how safe we played it but by how magnificently we lived. The weak self dies so that the strong self can be born. This is the Machiavellian transformation, the conscious, deliberate, and systematic conversion of human potential into human power, of possibility into reality, and of the person we were born as into the person we choose to become. The fortress of the strong stands not in opposition to the world but in service to it, offering not domination but leadership, not conquest but contribution. From this fortress, we do not retreat from life but engage with it more fully, armed with the strength to handle whatever comes and the wisdom to use that strength in service of purposes worthy of our newfound power. This is the culmination of human development, not the accumulation of external rewards but the internal transformation that makes all external achievements possible. Not the defeat of others but the victory over our own limitations. Not the end of struggle but the beginning of struggle in service of our highest aspirations. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has become indestructible from within. This is not metaphor but literal truth, for when we are no longer dependent on external validation, external rewards, or external security for our sense of worth and purpose, we become unconquerable. We may face setbacks, challenges, and even defeats, but we cannot be broken because our strength comes from an internal source that no external force can touch. This is the promise and the challenge of the Machiavellian transformation, to become so strong internally that no external force can diminish us, so clear about our purpose that no confusion can derail us, and so committed to our growth that no setback can stop us. It is the transformation from victim to victor, from reactor to creator, from follower to leader, and from weak to strong. The journey begins with a single step, continues with consistent effort, and culminates in the realization that we have become someone we once only dreamed of being. But it never truly ends, for the strong understand that strength must be maintained, power must be exercised responsibly, and the opportunity to grow never disappears. Choose strength. Choose growth. Choose to become indestructible not through avoiding challenges but through developing the capacity to meet any challenge. Choose to outgrow your past self and step into the strength that has been waiting within you all along. The weak self has served its purpose. Now it is time for the strong self to take the stage and show the world what human beings are truly capable of achieving when they refuse to accept limitation as their final answer. In the end, we are all faced with the same fundamental choice: remain trapped in the comfortable prison of our limitations, or break free into the uncertain but unlimited territory of our full potential. The weak choose the prison, the strong choose freedom. The question is not whether transformation is possible, it is inevitable for those who commit themselves to it completely. The only question is whether we will be among those who choose to transform or among those who choose to remain as they are. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, for he has faced his greatest enemy and emerged victorious. This is not the end of the story but the beginning of a new chapter, written not in the language of limitation but in the vocabulary of strength, not in the grammar of fear but in the syntax of power, not in the style of victimhood but in the voice of sovereignty. The choice is ours. The time is now. The transformation awaits.